Today's episode is brought to you by the letter R and the number 1. Let's begin with a story. Not long ago, I was in the library browsing around, and I came across their stack of Jack Reacher books. I thought, okay, I liked the first Jack Reacher movie and the first season of the series, so I'll give the books a shot. And as it happens, they had a copy of Killing Floor, which is not only what the first season is based on, but is also the first Jack Reacher novel. Perfect place to start. So I took it home and I read it. And it was bad. That could have been the end of the story, but there are a couple of wrinkles. The first wrinkle is a tear. My daughter got a hold of the book, and the Council of Elder Librarians decided it was an awkward enough tear and a new enough copy that the book now belonged to me. Ultimately, it took 2 librarians to figure out how to process this in the system, and both of these nice ladies attempted to engage me in conversation about the book. I say attempted, and that's the second wrinkle. For whatever reason, I found it difficult in that moment to express my thoughts on the matter. And I did have thoughts, I just had talked about them with my wife on the way over to the library. Maybe I thought it would be rude to air my grievances about the book to these strangers who are currently in the process of charging me for it. Or maybe I just haven't practiced expressing myself enough. So, that's what I'm going to do. When it comes to art, in the broadest sense of the term, it is, as they say, subjective, but there are always things that can be scrutinized. I may not be able to be purely objective about this book, but I do think there are flaws on a fundamental level that I want to address. That being said, I'm not going to argue that a favorable opinion of the book is wrong. Clearly, an entire Jack Reacher franchise is evidence that something has gone terribly right. People are allowed to like things that are bad. I certainly do. I love Dr. Pepper. Is it good for me? No, not in the slightest. Does knowing that dissuade me? Also no. Additionally, though it's easy to blame the author, Lee Child, a traditionally published work like this is a collaborative effort. It's impossible to know where the author ends and the editor begins, or any other contributors for that matter. So when I say author, I'm referring to a gestalt rather than a single person. To start off, there's nothing wrong with the writing on a basic level, and I mean basic, as in spelling and grammar. Not that mistakes like that would mean the author is bad at writing, per se. The internet is full of intellectuals who don't know the difference between its and its. The book does contain a considerable number of sentence fragments, but that's a deliberate stylistic choice, and I'm all for breaking rules for style. It's called creative writing for a reason. However, that brings us to one of the bigger problems, the writing style. I would describe it as fast-paced, choppy, and uncomplicated, which is all fine and good, just maybe not blanketed indiscriminately across the entire book. It works in short bursts for scenes of particularly high stakes, high energy, high speed, but starts to wear thin in the calmer scenes. Typically for me, writing style is either something I really like about a book, or else it's largely invisible. But here I was really struck by how it's functionally incongruent with portions of the story, and the character of Reacher. The narration is from his perspective, told in first person. So in addition to affecting the mood of a scene, the style should ostensibly reflect his mindset as well. But again, this is where it falls short, as the style never wavers regardless of what's happening or how he's feeling about it. It's pretty much a constant stream of his observations and actions. I would almost call it stream of consciousness, but there are way too many punctuation marks for that. I don't know what the metaphorical equivalent would be, maybe cobblestones of consciousness? Anyway, that brings us to the next issue, the incessant, useless details. So many pages are chock full of details that lack substance and ultimately amount to nothing. Much like the writing style, it could work if used sparingly and purposefully, but here it mostly functions as filler. I came to that conclusion pretty early on when Reacher is in the prison bus being taken to prison, and he observes the driver had the large sun visor down. On it were printed manufacturer's instructions about how to operate the bus. That line made me put down the book and consider my life choices. What is this information here for? What is it accomplishing? It's not relevant to the plot, it's not character building, it's not rhetorical, it's not an exercise in creative writing, and, speaking for myself, it's not interesting to the reader. It's just empty words. The story presents, in part, as an investigation, but Reacher's observations achieve very little. Occasionally he connects some dots and draws some conclusions, but there are a number of really big oversights that make him look a fool, so he seemingly likes to take note of everything around him for no reason. I even started to skim over blocks of text because it just looked like another chunk of empty description, but then I almost missed when he was actually using it to make a point. There's a part where he starts describing the two diner waitresses in excessive detail, all to show that wearing glasses was a distinguishing characteristic, which calls back to him being attacked in prison. Yet most, if not all, prior character illustrations were just background noise. So on the one hand, I'm incentivized to not care about what's being said, but on the other hand, sometimes the author will randomly remember that the main character is a pseudo-detective. Compound that with all of the minutiae of narration, which won't let a single door opening go undocumented, nor gravel drive go uncrunched. It reminds me of that time in elementary school, when the teacher told us to write up instructions to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. She then followed the instructions as literally as possible, and wound up with peanut butter all over her fingers and every available bread surface, because spread the peanut butter on the bread wasn't specific enough. I don't remember what the takeaway was supposed to be from that, but I guess the author understood it as creative writing advice, because there's a lot of show-don't-tell taken to its logical extreme. Approximately half the book is traveling between locations, and you really feel each step of the journey. Most of the time, Reacher et al. Are traveling by car, and I think the author realized it was getting repetitive, so he cycles through a variety of verbs to try and keep it fresh. Cars are endlessly slewing or nosing or bouncing or pulling into and out of driveways. The other half of the book is conversations, and that's where most of the actual plot takes place. I know there's no metric for poor writing, but I feel it qualifies when the majority of the book can be summarized as go to a place, have a conversation, repeat. At any rate, those are the big issues I have. I could go through a bunch of small stuff, but anything more would just be nitpicking. Okay, I can't help myself. None of the following are particularly egregious on their own. Rather, it's the cumulative effect that makes me ill, like radiation poisoning. First off, most of the characters are referred to by last name only, which, to be fair, does make sense. Reacher comes from military discipline, he's meeting these people for the first time, and most of them are in positions of authority. Where it does not make sense is Roscoe, the love interest. She is a police officer, but at the end of the book, Reacher really struggles with whether or not to stay with her permanently. He's developed genuine, deep feelings, and yet we never learn her first name. Finally, the TV series changes her name to Roscoe Conklin, but everyone just calls her Roscoe, despite it being her first name. I feel like that was a subtle jab by the show writers. Second, the population of the book feels too small. Granted, the setting is meant to be a small, forgotten, dying town, and I'm not asking for a Tolstoy-esque cast of characters, but we are dealing with what is described as the last source of counterfeit US currency for the world, and the entire operation is 10 people. Third, one of the early plot points is that a murder victim is difficult to identify because the bullet that went through his head blew his face off. The author's words, not mine. That point is resolved when we find out it was Reacher's brother, but he continues to mention the face thing a few more times after that, even though it doesn't serve a purpose anymore. It's not a particular point of offense over and above the murder itself, nor is it a jumping off point to philosophize about identity. It's just kind of randomly thrown in there, often enough to make me question why. Fourth, when Detective Finley exposits about his life, he says, "I called an old buddy in Atlanta FBI and asked him about it." Then, a few lines later, he says, "My friend up in Atlanta said forget it." There weren't any other friends mentioned in between, so he doesn't need to state the location a second time. Fifth, Reacher is given a gun to use, and in describing it are these two sentences back to back. This was the 8-shot .44 version. Takes 8 .44 Magnum shells. You could argue that he was clarifying, but it reads as simply repetitive. 6. The author uses the phrase "went quiet" incorrectly, despite using it correctly several other times. It's a nice little colloquialism that's intuitively understood to mean there was active talking happening, and then it stopped in a noticeable way. So it's odd when it shows up in the middle of a conversation where everybody is still participating. 7th, and this will be the closer, is this fantastic line that made me laugh. It was about as distinctive as the most distinctive thing you could ever think of. Was that a placeholder? It is your job as the writer to tell me things. Don't make me do your job for you. Well, that's all I have to say. Thank you for coming to this press conference. I won't be taking questions. So I remembered one other thing. All of the evil characters are described as ugly, which feels like a really amateur kind of thing to do.